Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Essential X-Men, Volume 5. This book contains issues 180 through 198 of the Uncanny X-Men series, as well as the 8th annual of that series. And last but not least, it also contains the two-parter X-Men and Alpha Flight, The Gift. So, the stories contained in this volume capture a point in the series wherein writer Chris Claremont was basically bringing the X-Men into the greater fold of the Marvel Universe and establishing that as far as the big picture was concerned, the X-Men were a vital component of things, and they had connections to stories and characters outside of their book, and also that there were stories and characters from other books that had connections to the X-Men in turn. So while there had never been any doubt as to whether or not the X-Men were a part of the Marvel Universe, Chris Claremont basically established that over time, and as a writer, I mean, and working with talented artists like Dave Cockrum and John Byrne and John Romita Jr. I mean, they worked together to give us a new group of X-Men that were unique in terms of, say, not only their powers but their personalities, and basically these characters from giant size X-Men to the actual X-Men series were gradually developed to where we saw them grow as individuals, and we also saw them working together as a cohesive team, and basically get to where they were more readily prepared and able to defend Professor Xavier's dream of humans and mutants living together in peace. Granted, that dream has yet to be achieved at this point, and even beyond this point. But the point is, this new group of X-Men, had been through so much and had grown so much that they stood a better chance of helping Professor Xavier to realize this dream, and basically building a bridge between humans and mutants. So with that being said, on one hand, this kind of helps the X-Men, basically it helps readers to get further invested in the book, because there are events that happen in this book that carry over to other books outside of the X-Men. So we definitely understand as readers that the X-Men were very important to ongoing stories outside of this series. But on the other hand, though, one of the downsides of this particular volume is that while the stories are all well written, maybe with the exception of a dud here and there are moments wherein the book crosses over with, say, another series. Like it might start off in an issue of X-Men, but it might continue in, say, issue such and such of the New Mutants, or issue such and such of Secret Wars. And so while it says to see what happens with this particular storyline, see issue such and such of New Mutants or Secret Wars, right? So I mean, while it at least says where this particular story is wrapped up in, the fact that the second part of, say, such a crossover isn't contained in this volume is kind of annoying. And so I can say that there are some instances wherein I can remember, say, from, the past of having, read some of the issues of New Mutants. And so I remember, vaguely, what happened in certain crossovers between X-Men and New Mutants or something like that. But I understand that not every reader of this particular, volume is going to have that advantage. And so that is a problem. Not to the point where, say, the book is, ruined or anything like that. I mean, it's still a great collection, but the fact that there are a few crossover chapters that turn up in this collection, wherein, say, the next part of the crossover isn't contained in this volume, and we'd have to, say, read something outside of this book, to see what happens. I mean, it's kind of annoying. And so I understand that this is already a big collection, and and it's got, say, a good chunk of X-Men lore contained herein. But even, say, if they weren't able to bring in, say, the next chapters of such crossovers in this volume, they could have at least, I think, maybe had some cliff notes contained, say, after say the ending of the X-Men portion of the crossover. They could have had, say, a Cliff Notes version saying, well, here's what happened in issue such and such of New Mutants in this story. So at the very least, we as readers, or those of us who are unfamiliar with what happened in other books outside the X-Men, will at least have some idea of what transpired. So I think that would have been more that would have been more helpful, as opposed to just, say, sticking with the original notes of see what happens in issue such and such for what happens next. So that was a problem, and I think that as far as problems go, this is this volume, I think, contains the first instance of that turning up. But that being said, Chris Claremont and the creative team, they work together enough so well. I mean, they work together well enough to basically try and bring the readers up to speed. And Chris Claremont is a good enough writer to where even if, say, the crossover chapters outside the X-Men aren't contained in this volume, then, say, the very next issue of the X-Men, Chris Claremont, as a writer, is able to, say, bring the reader up to speed as to what happened in that crossover, or at the very least the important parts of what happened. And so while it is frustrating not being able to see these crossover chapters, the fact that we're reading stories that are written by as capable of a writer as Chris Claremont, goes some way towards alleviating that problem. But I have to say that, I mean, this problem aside, I very much enjoyed this collection, and I think that, I mean, it continues, the trend of developing, these characters we've come to know and love, and even, say, the quote-unquote newer ones, that have become a part of the team, are basically, becoming family at this point. And, say, even in the issues wherein the New Mutants are brought into the story, Chris Claremont was, writing the New Mutants at the time as well as the X-Men. And so there's definitely a sense of familiarity, between the characters. And we never doubt that, the New Mutants and the X-Men are family, as well as, two, distinctive teams. But they're all under one roof. So there is that sense of community there. And I really, liked how, certain characters are basically, put in situations wherein, they're having to, contend with, say, either their own inner demons, and, trying to, decide, okay, how are we going to proceed from here? I mean, are we going to, take on are we going to take a darker stance on things, or are we going to try and rise above it, or is there something in the middle we can do? Because, I mean, at this point, it's been established that it's a very gray world that the X-Men live in, an exciting world and a fun world for us readers, but the danger is oftentimes very real, and there is kind of a bleed over from harsh reality into the realm of fiction here, because the government has never been the X-Men's friend, but this was a point where the government was wanting to step up the campaign to basically go after mutants, because, I mean, you go back to the stories contained in, volume 2 of Essential X-Men, and you had the two-parter Days of Future Past, wherein it was a classic time travel story, wherein, because of a political assassination of a politician named Senator Robert Kelly, by Mystique and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, basically public sentiment turned against the mutants, and as a result, America became a dictatorship, and that was, basically, run by the Sentinels, and they in turn took over the world. And so, with that storyline, we saw, the worst extent as to, what the government what could possibly do, to mutants, if things proceeded in such a manner as to allow this future to come to pass. But even, say, outside of that particular story, there have been moments in the series, wherein the X-Men have been caught up in battles wherein, there's been a lot of collateral damage, and so the government at times, is kind of seen as maybe having a point as to, hey, we need to take some steps to be able to protect humanity from mutants that are out of control, because unfortunately, while the X-Men are on the side of good, oftentimes they go up against foes that, whether they're mutant or not, do not have humanity's best interests at heart and are genuinely on the side of evil. And so when good and evil fight, there is unfortunately collateral damage at times. Then of course, you go into, straight up racism too, but there is a sense of, the racism, being, if not justified, then at least understandable at times, and, depending on, whose perspective we're seeing things from. But at the same time, at the end of the day, racism is racism, and it's never a good thing. And we see that quite clearly here. And so, like, we see how some people would lash out at mutants, because, they're understandably terrified of what certain mutants have been capable of doing. And they're thinking that all mutants are a threat because of this. And so while the fear is understandable, the actions of lashing out against, mutants, who are innocent, I mean, it's not justifiable. So, we kind of see that here. But at the same time, we're never meant to, say, take the sides of, say, those who want to eliminate mutants, okay? So, but at the same time, we've gotten to a point where, the concerns, are understandable to an extent, but the actions cross the line. But, with that being said, you also have elements wherein, you know, you have the characters, continue to grow and thrive, and sometimes they go through harsh times, and other times they go through you know good times. I mean, just like or everyday life, right? But one of the things that happens here is, I mean, you have Colossus and Kitty Pryde, and Colossus being the Russian Peter Rasputin, and Kitty, who would eventually become Shadowcat. But you have the two of them who had a budding romantic relationship, have some complications, thrown into the mix, because you had the fact that Colossus was older than Kitty, and legally speaking, the two of them couldn't be in a relationship together. So there was that problem. But also, you have the fact that, Kitty, at this point in time, was kind of a member of both X-Men and the New Mutants. I mean, so she was like a full-time member of the New Mutants, but she would also be with the X-Men as well. So, or I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was when it came to, say, her education, she was, staying with the New Mutants. But when it came to, say, the missions and what have you, she was a full-on member of the X-Men. So, but she had become really good friends with a young man named Doug Ramsey, who would eventually take the codename Cypher, because he could basically, understand and speak any language, even going into, say, the realm of electronics. So pretty nifty. But Kitty and Doug were becoming really good friends, and Colossus was, becoming jealous. And plus, there was the fact that he's still recovering from severe injuries that he they had from some of the stories in the last volume. So he's still, mentally and physically, shaken up. And so when he sees, Kitty and, Doug getting along so well, he becomes jealous. And, Wolverine's, trying to set him straight, saying, hey, do you really think that if she didn't love you, she wouldn't have been willing to marry, Caliban, because that was one of those plots from, the last volume. Basically, Callisto and the Morlocks, basically put Kitty in a position to where if they helped save Colossus, then she'd have to marry Caliban, and so she had to give her word that she would do so if they kept their word. But Caliban was basically, and while he did love Kitty, he saw that she didn't love him, and she loved Colossus, and he realized that he couldn't do this to a young girl. And so, he said there's going to be no wedding, and, basically let Kitty go in peace, as did the Morlocks. But, Wolverine's reminding Colossus of that. And so, he's having to, ruminate on that. But then you also have something happen with, Kitty and Storm, Ororo. And the two of them have been experiencing some tension in their friendship, because Storm had taken on, say, a more darker stance in her outlook on life, and Kitty had always looked up to Storm as sort of a, not only as a friend, but as a sort of surrogate mother figure, because she had gone through the ordeal of her parents divorcing, and that really shook her up. And so she was kind of looking to Storm, to be the mother that, she couldn't have. But Storm's having to tell her that, you know, everyone goes through changes in life. I mean, everyone goes through, life experiences that alter their perceptions on things, and to a point where, sometimes, two people, or just people who care about each other, have to, one of them has to break away because they have to resolve, their own, problems in their own way. And so, Storm also points out that, while, it's understandable, for, Kitty to not want things to change between them, it's not fair, for Kitty to, want things to change in her life, but she's not wanting things to change in Storm's life. And so, she's also pointing out that, while, she loves Kitty as a friend, she is not her mother, and it's unfair for Kitty to hold her to that standard. But the two of them, basically, patch things up, and they are able to go forward with in being friends. But one of the things that happens, though, to sort of complicate things, between Kitty and Colossus, along with, besides Kitty's friendship with Doug Ramsey, was this little thing called the Secret Wars, which was a rather momentous storyline in the Marvel universe, wherein this alien being called the Beyonder kidnapped several heroes and villains and brought them to this planet of his to battle it out. And I mean, it's a long story, right? But but one of the things that happened was, several of the X-Men were taken by the Beyonder, and this happened right when Kitty and Doug were involved in a storyline in the New Mutants, and so that's where one of the crossovers comes into play. But one of the things that happened in the Secret Wars, which we don't see here, but we hear about it from other characters in this book. Colossus, on this battle world, had met this woman who, well, she was an alien, but she was like a healer or something, and neither of them could speak the other's language, but they were able to form enough of a connection to where they fell in love. But this alien healer was tragically killed at some point in the Secret Wars story, and this really shook Peter up because he had loved Kitty, but he also loved this woman. And so when the X-Men are returned to Earth, after the whole Secret Wars story is over, Colossus is at a point where he's very uncertain about things. While he does care about Kitty, he genuinely fell head over heels in love with this alien woman that he met, and she came to really love him too. And having her die in front of him was something that traumatized him. And so when he comes back from that, he essentially breaks things off with Kitty, and that upsets her to a point where she tries to I guess become a little more detached from Colossus. Like, she still cares about him and everything, but she's goes out of her way to not be quite as involved with him because of that. Because if she continues to try and pursue him, that's not going to help either of them, because he's having to resolve his own inner turmoil, and it's not fair for either of them if she tries to force something to work that's not going to work. So there's that little storyline. It's kind of like a soap opera, but except in this case, it's a soap opera with characters that we've actually come to care about. But you also have, several other things that happen. You have, this one character who was introduced in the New Mutants, but she becomes a threat in the X-Men book as well. An evil mutant named Selene, who's kind of like this energy vampire almost in a way, and she's been around for thousands of years. But she becomes a threat to the team when she sets her sight on Rachel Summers, who was introduced back in Volume 2 of Essential X-Men, but who made a return, both in New Mutants and this book at this point. And Rachel Summers was the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey in another reality, but she somehow found her way to the X-Men's reality, wherein she starts to find out that she was able to go back in time, to try and change the future, because in her future, after the end of the Days of Future Past storyline, basically all the X-Men were dead except for her. Spoiler, right? And so she figured, okay, well, if I'm the last one left, I mean, I may as well see if I can, do for myself what I did for Kitty, and basically, send my consciousness, or send either my consciousness or myself, back in time. But she was able to, succeed in a way. She did go back to the past, but not the past of, her reality. It's the past of another reality. And so basically, you have, this girl who, is on par with Jean Grey in terms of, say, mental, and telepathic and telekinetic abilities and what have you. But at the same time, she's a teenager who, is traumatized from this, hellish future, and, she's having to interact with, I guess you could say 20th century, or I could say modern day racism, in a sense of humans, being racist towards mutants, and her being a telepath. I mean, she has a hard time, keeping, stray thoughts out, and and she becomes even more disillusioned, with humanity, and begins to question whether or not things could ever change, but she's also shaken up when she comes to realize that while in her reality, she's the daughter of Scott or Cyclops and Jean Grey, in this reality, Jean Grey's dead, because she sacrificed her life at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, and and Cyclops at this point is married to Madeline Pryor, a woman who is a strong look-alike of Jean Grey, but very different in personality, and just entirely by coincidence, that her and Scott ended up meeting and falling in love, and basically forming such a connection to where they ended up getting married, and it turns out that Scott and Madeline have a baby on the way, and it's a boy, and so, or it's going to be a boy. And so when Rachel finds out about this, I mean, she's just devastated, because not only is her mother dead in this reality, but Cyclops or Scott isn't going to be her father, and so this is something that really shakes her up, and so she's having to contend with all this, and then she has this this energy vampire, named Selene, who's targeting her because she feeds on humans and mutants, but the more powerful the a mutant, though, the bigger meal she gets, or the more she's able to get, from the feeding. And so when she crosses paths with Rachel, I mean, you never experienced, or she's never felt someone, as powerful as, Rachel Summers is, because Rachel, while she's, conscious of her abilities, there's so much more that she's capable of that she hasn't gotten to yet as far as her powers go. And Selene is able to pick up on this. And so she actually, comes very close to, killing Rachel. But thankfully, the X-Men are able to, led by Charles Xavier at this point, are able to save Rachel, from Selene. But unfortunately, Selene gets away. But on the plus side, Rachel is officially, brought into the X-Men. And so she's got this, group of, friends and sort of a surrogate family, to look after her and to help her sort of adapt to life in modern times, so to speak. But it's an obsession that Selene never gives up on. I mean, she's got her eyes set on Rachel. But Rachel, though, actually plays a big part in, the X-Men choosing to stay together as a team, because, one of the things that had happened at one point in this book was that Rogue had attacked a SHIELD helicarrier because she's found out that someone that she knows, a guy named Michael Rossi, someone that she knows and cares about and, was even in love with at one point, he was a SHIELD agent, and he was being held prisoner in the SHIELD helicarrier because, he was, trying to leak certain information to Professor X in regards to the Hellfire Club. And this was something that, got him in a lot of trouble because he was kind of working on his own when he wasn't supposed to be. And so he's being interrogated, and some of the people interrogating him are actually, beating him up. And so, not everyone in SHIELD is, the good guy that Nick Fury is, unfortunately. And so Rogue, when she finds out about this, she single-handedly breaks into the SHIELD helicarrier and does a lot of damage, but she's able to get Michael Rossi out. And she takes him back to, this place that she knows. But it turns out, though, she doesn't know Michael Rossi. It's Carol Danvers who knew him. And because Carol Danvers, of course, was Miss Marvel, and Rogue rather infamously, absorbed Miss Marvel's, powers as well as her memories. And so with this in mind, one of the things that Rogue struggles with in this issue, as well as in the stories prior to this one, was the fact that she's stuck with not only her own memories, but the memories of Carol Danvers. And it gets to a point where at times she has a hard time distinguishing, which ones are which, because in this case, in the case of Michael Rossi, something happened to where, she was thinking that Michael Rossi was her friend and former lover, but it was actually Carol Danvers who had the relationship with Michael Rossi. And Michael Rossi's having to, set Rogue straight, and, he's asking her these questions, and Rogue's able to answer them, but they're answers that only Carol Danvers would know. But then she realizes that there's no way she would have been involved with Michael because, she's just like 18, and, Michael and Carol were, adults when the two of them, got together. And so that's when Rogue's like, oh my God, this is Carol's mind, breaking through, and these are her memories, overriding mine. And so, this is something that, really shakes Rogue up, because it's a further reminder of how much damage she did, to Carol Danvers and those she cared about. by absorbing her powers and her memories. And so because of the damage to the shield helicarrier, there are certain forces at work that are basically able to use this to further their own agenda against mutants. And so with the government using that as an excuse to step up their campaign against mutants, basically, I mean, there were other things that happened too, but Nightcrawler is wanting to basically break up the X-Men. Like he asks Xavier to call a meeting, and basically he lays it all out that the government is intent on destroying mutants or imprisoning mutants at this point, and it's coming close to becoming a reality. What they're talking about could very well come to pass, and the X-Men have laid their lives down on the line for humanity on more than one occasion, but every time they do so, it's like for every friend they gain from humanity, there are several more people that want to kill them just because they're mutants. And so, and Nightcrawler also points out the people who have been hurt by this. And one of the things that had also happened at this point was that Storm had lost her powers, or she had had them taken from her, in part because of the government. Because at this point, with the whole storyline with Rogue, the government was using that as an excuse to step up their campaign against mutants. And in this case, they enlisted a mutant named Forge, who was a member of the Cheyenne Native American tribe, who has the ability to basically build any sort of electronic that he can think of. And he has like a prosthetic leg that he built himself to replace the one he lost in Vietnam. And since Tony Stark stopped supplying arms to the government in his own book, the government turned their eyes to Forge. And so Forge is someone he's got a military background, but he's also a mutant, and he's willing to use his abilities to say work with the government. But he has this gun that he's built, and it's a prototype, but it's something that it was based on the designs of a character named Rom, who was a space knight who was engaged in war with this group of demonic aliens called dire wraiths. And the dire wraiths had basically invaded Earth, and that was part of an ongoing storyline in Rom's own series. But basically Forge had been able to somehow or another get some information about Rom's weaponry, I believe. And the government gave Forge what they knew about Rom's neutralizer, which he was using specifically against the dire wraiths, something that was meant to do away with their powers, or to get rid of their powers, I believe, and before sending them to a place called Limbo, which was like this hellish prison dimension that Rom sent the dire wraiths to after he defeated them. But he had this neutralizer that could detect dire wraiths, and as well as neutralize their powers, I believe. It's been a while since I read the Rom series, but they touch on it in this book. But Forge, though, was able to build this prototype and this gun that was able to, in theory, neutralize the powers of either a mutant or just a superpowered being. but in this case, because the government's wanting something that they can use against mutants, albeit in the manner of self-defense, Forge built this prototype for them. And so there's this guy named Gyrich, who is a member of the government and is basically, got his own agenda against mutants. In some ways, an understandable agenda. In others, you're like, okay, you're going from, understandably, wanting to defend yourself against, mutants and their unpredictable abilities, but also you're wanting to do away with them as a race. And so, Gyrich is not a nice guy, but he takes the prototype, which was actually given to him by a government representative named Valerie Cooper. And, this was without Forge's knowledge. And Gyrich is wanting to use this prototype against Rogue, because of her attack on the SHIELD helicarrier. And SHIELD being a part of the American government, well, that's an attack on the American government right there. And so Gyrich had in a team, a military team had tracked Rogue down, and it was at this point that Rogue was talking to Storm, and basically opening up to her about what had happened with Michael Rossi and the stuff that's going on in her head. And Storm was basically in the process of helping her, come to terms with things. And unfortunately, it was then that, this military, squad came in, and Gyrich, was trying to use the gun on Rogue, but ended up hitting Storm instead. And unfortunately, this took away Storm's power. And so now Storm's just an ordinary human and is having to, adapt to the situation. But she's more or less been maimed by this. And so this is one of the instances that Nightcrawler brings up. The fact that, we've had, members of our team maimed and killed. And when he mentions, the people that are killed, like Thunderbird and Jean Grey, that's, what sets, Rachel Summers off, in this conversation, when they're having this conversation. And Rachel basically, she, begs, the team to stay together, and she, confides in them and tells them about the future that she comes from. And, basically saying that, if the X-Men don't exist, then this future will almost certainly come to pass, because there'll be nothing there, to counteract, the threat of, the Sentinels. And so, with that in mind, the X-Men, they decide that even though, things are looking more and more grim with the way the government's doing things, they do need to stay together, because if they, do so, then at least there's a chance that they can change things. And so, yeah, that was a rather important part of the, ongoing storyline in this book. And of course, with the whole Wraith situation, there's some fallout from that still, because when the Wraiths find out that Forge had constructed this prototype that was based on the weapons of Rom, the Space Knight, they come to believe that this is a weapon that could be used against them, even though it wasn't built to go after the Wraiths, but mutants. The Wraiths believed that this weapon in time could be turned against them, because at this point, like say in the book of Rom Space Knight, there was this ongoing storyline wherein the American government was aware of the Wraith threat and was trying to find some measures of defense against them. And so when they learned that the prototype for the neutralizer was based on the designs of Rom's weaponry, they came to see Forge as a threat. And so they go and try to kill him at his headquarters, where he, at this point in time, he had been holding Storm um, sort of in a gilded cage type prison, but except, he was trying to take care of her and, protect her from, people from the government that were wanting to, say, put her in a straight up prison and interrogate her. But unfortunately, though, when Storm finds out that, Forge was the one who built the gun that took her powers, she, basically comes to distrust him, because up until that point, she was coming to care about Forge and vice versa. But once that cat was out of the bag, well, yeah, the two of them have a sort of awkward relationship with one another, going forward. But it's like, they care about each other, but at the same time they, want to stop each other, from their own, I guess, like Forge wants to, control Storm, for her own protection, and Storm, wants to hurt Forge for hurting her. But at the same time, the two of them, really, in the time that they were, living together in this sort of gilded cage prison that Forge put together, that they did get to know each other and care about each other. So it's complicated. But what ended up happening, though, was the Dire Wraiths had gone after Forge, and, Storm was basically having to go in and try and help him. And the only other person who was able to help her was a guy named Naz, who was sort of a surrogate father for Forge, and was wanting Forge to, take his place as a tribal shaman. But Forge, was wanting nothing to do with that, because that was a part of his life that he, had closed the book on. But what ends up happening, though, is, Storm and Naz, they're able to fight back against the Dire Wraiths. And even though Storm doesn't have her powers, she's able to use firearms, because Wolverine had trained her at one point, to use guns. And even though Storm, doesn't, like killing, she understands that, in her line of work, she needs, something to defend herself with. And Wolverine had pointed out in the past that, because she's the peaceful one, none of her enemies would, expect her to have a gun. And so there you go. And it comes in handy. Her and Naz are able to put up a fight against the Dire Wraiths, while Forge is able to, use his technology to do the same. But unfortunately, though, Naz is seemingly killed by one of the Dire Wraiths. And this Dire Wraith had taken his form, because what they do is they, it's like, once they kill someone, they take basically their essence, their soul, for lack of a better term, as well as their physical form. And this had happened with Naz at some point off panel. And Naz goes to a part of Forge's, headquarters, where he's got this sort of inner sanctum, because Forge, as it turns out, has some, level of skill in the area of sorcery, because of his, his tribal connections. But because it's something that he wants nothing to do with, it's something that he tries to avoid, taking part in. And so, but when Naz, who had been killed by a Dire Wraith, breaks into, Forge's inner sanctum, while Forge and Storm are, fighting against the Dire Wraiths, this, possessed Naz, tries to reach out to his own dark gods and offer up Earth as a sacrifice, for the Dire Wraiths. as a conquest. Somehow this results in Naz making contact with a whole other evil entity entirely. And this is something that, if I remember correctly, comes up in later issues, where there was this force called the Adversary that was an old enemy of Forge and his tribe. And at this point in time, you don't learn about it, but this is where the Adversary is first introduced as this whole other evil entity that, instead of this dire Wraith making contact with its dark gods, because it's using the powers in Forge's inner sanctum, it inadvertently makes contact with the Adversary. And so the Adversary absorbs not only Naz, who in turn had been absorbed by a dire Wraith, but this Adversary basically takes Naz's form and decides to, say, work behind the scenes while pretending to be Forge's surrogate father figure. And so the X-Men, they come into the fray, and they're able to basically save the day from the dire Wraiths, because they also bring in some reinforcements. They have Nightcrawler's sorceress girlfriend Amanda, as well as Ilyana Rasputin, who had become a sorcerer in her time in Limbo. And so the two of them, working with the X-Men, were able to put up a fight against the remaining dire Wraith, who was using dark sorcery. But it was ultimately Nightcrawler teleporting Forge to the rooftop where the dire Wraith was, and Forge was able to basically execute the dire Wraith on the spot, thus ending the threat. But so basically all of that ended up leading to the X-Men having this big conversation about, okay, should we even stay on as a team at this point, because of all the stuff that's happened, and it's like we just keep getting more and more hurt by this world that we're trying to defend. And so, but thankfully with Rachel telling them the truth about where she came from and reminding them of what might happen should the X-Men not exist anymore. Excuse me. The X-Men ultimately decide to stay together, but but unfortunately though, Selene, this energy vampire, she still has her sights set on Rachel, and she also goes after this girl named Amara, who's a member of the New Mutants, who has these volcanic abilities. But basically though, while she's going after them, she's also trying to become a member of the Hellfire Club. And so with this going on, this ends up resulting indirectly in a storyline wherein this demonic sorcerer named Kulan Gath emerges and basically turns New York into something from the time of Conan the Barbarian, more or less. And how that ended up happening was that there was this dock worker who found this amulet, this necklace, and this evil voice was coming from it, basically demanding that he put this necklace on, and and saying that he'll be granted immense power and immortality. But this guy, he's able to basically fight it off and just keep from putting the necklace on. But unfortunately, he's mugged and killed. And when this mugger's going through his stuff and gets the necklace and puts it, he decides to put it on, and that's what basically frees this demonic sorcerer named Kulan Gath, because somehow or another in another conflict, Kulan Gath had been imprisoned in this necklace. And so by being freed, he's able to basically reassert himself on the mortal plane and basically, start to change the world around him into the world that he came from, which was in the time of Conan the Barbarian and Red Sonja and what have you. And so New York is basically, shut off from, the outside world. And anyone going into New York, is turned into, say, I guess you could say, their ancient counterpart. Like, any modern day vehicle that goes into New York is turned into, say, like a carriage or something like that. And, the superheroes there in New York are basically turned into, say, their ancient counterparts and what have you. And so with this going on, Selene is one of the few people who retains her memories. And she's gone up against Kulan Gath before in the past. And so she actually tries to form an alliance, with the X-Men, because at this point, the majority of the X-Men are in New York. And so they've been changed as well. But Storm is one of the few who had been able to regain her memories by way of, I guess you could say, the stress of, mortal combat, because, she and Callisto, who at this point in time had their, ancient, they had basically become their otherworldly or ancient counterparts. The two of them fought each other, and Callisto who was working in the employ of, Kulan Gath in this reality, she ends up, wounding Storm, because she retained her hatred for Storm, or her dislike for Storm, for having usurped her role of leadership in the Morlocks. But, Storm, this flash of pain, basically reminds her of who she really is. And so she, basically tackles, Callisto, because they're fighting on this boat on the masts, right? And she tackles Callisto, off the masts and into the water. And she's able to pull Callisto, through the barrier. And then that's when the two of them completely regain their memories. But unfortunately, though, they realize, how bad the situation is. But when Selene, comes and offers her alliance, she's offering it to them specifically because they're the only ones that were able to break through and regain their memories. And she's able to, offer them a deal, basically that, she can't prevent them from, fully, turning back into their ancient counterparts, but she can, basically preserve their memories so they'll, know what needs to be done, and so basically they accept Selene's deal because at this point, what other alternative is there? And so they go back through and they find as many of their, of their ancient counterparts, of say like other superheroes and other X-Men as they can, to fight back against Kulan Gath, who at this point is torturing Spider-Man because Spider-Man in some other adventure had basically defeated Kulan Gath or played a part in defeating him. And Kulan Gath was wanting to use his opportunity to, torture and, and eventually murder, Spider-Man, but using his blood, to basically further his own dark powers. But, basically though, this makeshift team is able to come together and, fight back against Kulan Gath's forces. And they're able to make enough of a difference, even though, several of them end up, getting killed. They're able to make enough of a difference to where the necklace, is removed from Kulan Gath, because that was something that Spider-Man was trying to tell them. You take the necklace from him, and you have a chance against him. And so ultimately, Kulan Gath's defeated, and as it happens, this kind of causes like this ripple effect in time. And so the X-Men that were present in this, they sort of emerge back into modern times in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum, and because he had been held prisoner by Kulan Gath, but he was one of the few people who understood what was going on. But Kulan Gath had prevented him from, being able to get help and, tell people what was going on, by holding him prisoner in this mystical binding and what have you. But the X-Men in Doctor Strange, they emerged back in his place, and they're asking what happened, and basically Doctor Strange has explained to them that they've prevented one reality from coming to pass, and so they're the only ones who have any memory of it, though. And so they're like, well, once again, we try to defend humanity, and they don't even, and humanity's not even going to know it. But it turns out there is one person there who's a part of humanity who does know it, Captain America, because he was one of the people that was caught up in all this. But he basically tells them thank you, and says that you guys have a friend from here on out, as well as the friends with the Avengers. So in the meantime, though, because of all this, this necklace, in the present, it goes back to that point in time where the guy who had the necklace was about to be mugged. But one of the ripple effects of this whole changing of the time thing is that something is brought back from the timeline of Rachel Summers, like something about the magic and the temporal forces sort of colliding with one another from this reality ending. Basically, on one hand, it brings in this sentinel from Rachel's reality called Nimrod, who is basically like this borderline sentient robot who's programmed to kill mutants, but also to defend humans and fight crime. And so when it emerges in our reality, the first thing it sees is someone about to be assaulted, namely the guy who had the necklace that had Kulan Gath in it. And so when he sees that this guy's about to be assaulted and murdered, Nimrod basically vaporizes the mugger right after the mugger had attacked the guy, but before he could kill him. But in the process, the guy loses the necklace, and it goes into the water, and basically it ends up drifting away. And of course Kulan Gath is stuck in a necklace for another Lord knows how many years. So that's one threat averted. But in the meantime, though, Nimrod befriends this guy that he saved, and is taken in by his family, or him and his family, and he's basically able to reconfigure his appearance to where he's more human in the way his facial structure is and what have you. And he's trying to brush up on what's going on in modern times and what have you. And he's confused, because it's like he doesn't really know how he came to be in our reality. But nonetheless, I mean, here he is. And he's come to realize, much like Rachel Summers, that, while he's in the past, it's not his past. And so basically, while he still has the primary, objective of hunting down mutants, he's also questioning that because, you know, if the reality that, he came from doesn't exist anymore, then what's his purpose? And so basically, he takes it upon himself to, you know, kind of watch things and see, what happens so he can better understand things. And in the meantime, one of the other things that happens is, um, it, Sean Cassidy, aka Banshee, um, who was staying on Muir Isle with Moira McTaggart, uh, is kidnapped by a ghost, or he considers him a ghost. It's actually um, a guy named James Proudstar, who was the brother of John Proudstar, aka Thunderbird. And so James Proudstar was someone who was introduced in an issue of New Mutants as a member of this group called the Hellions, who were a group of, I guess you could say, a distaff, counterpart to the X-Men or to the New Mutants, but run by Emma Frost at her school. And so, James Proudstar, basically had a grudge against the X-Men and Professor Xavier for getting his brother killed. And so, because he was, the first of, the new X-Men to die on one of their first missions. So, he kidnaps, Sean Cassidy and, takes him, to, below, takes him to Cheyenne Mountain, and holds him, hostage beneath, that mountain, because it's a military base that, the X-Men had, had that encounter with Count Nefaria, which in turn resulted in Thunderbird getting killed. And so, he basically sends a message to the X-Men saying that, he's holding, Banshee, hostage, and if the X-Men want to see him again, they need to come meet him at Cheyenne Mountain, underneath the mountain range. And so the X-Men at this point, they're, they decide, okay, obviously we need to go rescue Sean. And Professor Xavier, he's leading the mission, but unfortunately, he's at a point where, he is not able to use his power. Like, he's able to walk, but he can't use his powers because he had been mugged by a group of, college students who were anti-mutant and basically were targeting, anyone who spoke up for mutants. And they had hurt him to such a degree that, he was nearly killed, but, the Morlocks found him, and Callisto herself, took him in and had, their healer, come and repair his body as best as he could. And so while the healer was able to save Xavier, Callisto, makes it clear that he needs to rest. And, basically, any sort of exertion, on part of him using his power could do irreversible damage to his body, because his body, it was that close to being, he was that close to being killed. He was that close to death. And so with this in mind, Professor Xavier, is able to lead the mission, but he's not able to use his powers, which would have made things a lot easier. And so at this point, Nightcrawler is the field leader, because, at this point, Storm who had been the team leader, had left, because, she was wanting to go to Africa, to sort of rediscover herself, because Africa is where she came from. And without her powers now, she needs to find out, okay, who is she as a person now? And so she left the team for a time being, and Nightcrawler's and, the field leader. And so the X-Men, though, and trying to rescue Banshee, they end up running into a trap set by some fellow members of the Hellions, that are working with James Proudstar. And these are Roulette, Empath, and Firestar. And Roulette, she has the ability to basically adversely affect one's, luck, so to speak. And Empath is able to basically control you and make you do anything he wants you to do. And so he manipulates Firestar, who's able to basically, she's a pyrokinetic and she's able to fly. But he manipulates her into joining them, with his powers. And so the three of them, they're trying to help, James, but they're doing so in such a way that is putting a lot of people in danger. Whereas James, he's not wanting to put, other people in danger. He's just trying to get his revenge, or he's trying to avenge his brother's death by going after Sean Cassidy and Professor Xavier, and in turn the X-Men. But when he sees, what's going on, and how Empath and Roulette are, manipulating things to where, the military personnel are, going after the X-Men and literally trying to kill them, even though these same personnel had, allied with the X-Men, on that mission a long time ago when they came to Cheyenne Mountain. James is, realizing that this is getting out of hand. And also when he sees the X-Men in action, he sees that they're not evil. Like, they're, trying to, help each other, and they care about each other. They're not just the evil monsters that, he believed that they were, or that he wanted to believe that they were. And so he actually, helps them. Like, he helps Wolverine, and he helps, Kitty Pryde at one point. But he can't really explain why. He just saw that, Wolverine risked his life to save hers, and they were in a position where they were about to be killed, and he couldn't bring himself to let it happen. So he saved them, but he's like, okay, I saved them, but I'm going after Xavier. And so sure enough, at one point in the story, Xavier finds himself at Proudstar's mercy, and he can't defend himself. Like, if he tries to use his powers in any way, his body will more than likely, start to self-destruct on a, biological level. And so, he's having to, rely on, his on his, training, like his psychological training and what have you. And, he's able to actually get through to James and, and ask him, do you really think that, I made your brother join the team against his will? Do you really think, I, forced him, to, get himself killed? And he's pointing out that, John Proudstar was one of the strongest people he knew, and had such a, powerful, level of individualism, that, he, was someone that, Professor X, was wanting to, help, and he was wanting to, further, train him, because he saw that, he would be a vital, component to the team, someone with his, strength and his, determination and everything. And the more he tells him about, how he got to know John in the short amount of time that he was on the team, the more James comes to realize that, Professor X and the X-Men weren't responsible for, John's death. And, Professor X, is telling him that, John, when he died, he did so in such a way to where, he was able to pick the time and place of his death, and he died in the way that he wanted to die. And so, as James is listening to all this and he's remembering his brother, he comes to realize that, Professor X is telling the truth. And so in the end, he decides not to kill Professor X and thus avenge his brother. And he's, calling himself a coward. But Professor X, he, comes to, James's aid and tells him that, you're not a coward. Do you think you're a coward for, not being able to kill someone? No, you're someone of great courage and great strength. I mean, it takes a lot to, put your own, vendetta aside, basically, to put your need for vengeance aside, for, the good of others. And, basically to, realize that, you were wrong about something. I mean, that takes a lot of courage. And so, at the end of the day, on the one hand, the military is, in the American government is further against the X-Men than they already were. But on the other hand, James is able to, part with the X-Men on peaceful terms. And, he takes Roulette and Empath and Firestar, back to where, Emma Frost's school is. Because the thing is, I mean, even though Emma Frost is someone that, is an enemy of the X-Men, she does care about her students. And so, basically, James also has friends, at her school, and he can't just bring himself to, leave them, because he's telling the X-Men that Roulette and Empath, I mean, yeah, they what they did was wrong, but the thing is, not everyone at the school is like that. There are good people there, and he can't bring himself to leave them. And so he leaves the X-Men, but on good terms. And so the X-Men, come to find that they have someone that they can call a friend there. So with that, from there, it's just, there's like a lot of stuff that happens in this book. And I mean, a lot of personal stuff. That comes about from, say, fantastic events. And, when it comes to, say, like the one, storyline that takes place, apart from all this, I mean, it's still part of, the main story, but it's not a part of the ongoing story. It's, the X-Men and Alpha Flight story, and that's when they run afoul of Loki, of all people, who basically manipulates things, because he's, trying to, get into, a better position, in Asgard. And he manipulates things to where, X-Men and Alpha Flight are initially going against each other, but then they come to realize that, hey, there's something pulling the strings. And so they end up finding this place that, has like, fantastical Asgardian architecture. And this place, it's inhabited by Cyclops and Madeline Pryor and a survey team that they had gone away with, but that had, crash landed due to Loki's manipulations. And basically, the X-Men and Alpha Flight, they find out that, this place has this, magical, wellspring, wherein, they're able to, basically have the equivalent of Asgardian powers. And amongst other things, Cyclops, doesn't have to worry about his optic blasts going out of control anymore. And so, the X-Men and Alpha Flight, like, they're able to, basically see, a possibility of, not being, held down by powers that would prevent them from, say, being with other people. Like in the case of Rogue, she's not having to worry about, her touch, taking someone's life, because of this magic and everything. And Puck from Alpha Flight, he's, transformed from, his dwarven body to an ordinary body, and he's like a full-grown man now. And so basically there's these wondrous things that are happening, but it turns out there's a price for all this. And as it happens, anyone who's connected to magic, outside of this Asgardian place, is basically being leached of energy and being drained dry. So Shaman and Snowbird from Alpha Flight, because their abilities are magical in nature, they're slowly dying. And so when Wolverine finds out about all this, he reveals the truth to the X-Men, and so as a result, the X-Men and Alpha Flight, they have this sort of almost not quite a civil war, but it's like there's two sides here. So there's two camps that form, that are made up of members of the Madeline and Scott's survey team, as well as Alpha Flight and the X-Men. So there's two camps made up of people from all these parties. One group is wanting to hold on to these Asgardian powers that they have, because there's so much that they could do for the world and use the magic for. But it's going to be but at the same time, the other side is, while they see the good that they could do, they also realize that, hey, a lot of people that we care about are connected to magic. I mean, you have Nightcrawler's girlfriend Amanda, you have Doctor Strange, who's helped the team on multiple occasions. There's Ilyana Rasputin, because she's a sorceress now. I mean, and so basically, the two parties eventually, after fighting each other, they come to realize that, I mean, it's, at the end of the day, it's not worth it. Like, when they're seeing what it would cost in terms of, say, people that they know and care about dying, like, they realize it's not, in their view, it's not worth it. And so this ruins Loki's plans, because he was wanting to manipulate things to where, if they had all accepted these abilities, then those that are like the Asgardian gods that are above him would have given him this new position. But because he manipulated things and forced them into his position, basically the deal's null and void, the deal that he made with those gods that are above him. And so with that in mind, these gods, they force Loki to promise that the X-Men and Alpha Flight can leave this place in peace, and basically he won't harm them from here on out. And because if he had just accepted their decision peacefully, then that would have allowed him to pass the test with these gods. But because he tried to force them to accept his gift, then that basically made the deal null and void. And so he reluctantly allows X-Men and Alpha Flight to depart, albeit with the price of like some of them going back to the states that they were in prior to all this, to this adventure. I mean, you have Sasquatch going back to, say, his borderline, feral state, and then you have Puck reverting back to his dwarven state, and you have Rogue going back to, not being able to touch anyone with her, bare hands, and so, that particular adventure ends, and the book ends on a note wherein after it goes back to, say, the ongoing storyline, wherein in this point Nimrod had gone after the X-Men and Juggernaut, because Juggernaut had shown up a couple of times in this story or in this book, and because Juggernaut, while he wasn't a mutant, he was a criminal, and he was making his presence known in New York, and so Nimrod made a point to go after Juggernaut since he was an established threat to humanity. But when the X-Men came on the scene, he goes after them as well, because that's part of his programming, to kill mutants. And so the X-Men basically get their butts kicked by him until Rogue, in a measure of desperation, absorbs the powers of Colossus and Nightcrawler and is able to teleport one of Nimrod's limbs away from his body, and then do enough damage with she was just able to do that using Nightcrawler's teleportation abilities. But then she uses Colossus's strength to shatter Nimrod's body, and that seemingly defeats Nimrod. But Nimrod basically comes back together and repairs himself, but enough damage was done to him to where he retreats from the battle. And so the X-Men are basically able to come around and regroup, and they point out to Juggernaut that they literally saved his life, and so he decides not to press the issue and leaves the scene. But so Nimrod is in a position where he's still trying to decide what his purpose is at this point, but he's gone up against these X-Men for a first time, and he's making notes as to what to do in the future. But the story the book ends on a note where it's kind of a follow-up to the story where Storm and Forge got close to one another. And that particular story was called Lifedeath. The one where Forge had Storm at his headquarters as kind of a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the two of them got to know one another. So the last story in this volume was basically a follow-up to that in a roundabout way. It's called Lifedeath 2, and both Lifedeath and Lifedeath 2 had artwork by Barry Windsor Smith. But Storm at this point is in Africa, trying to basically rediscover herself as an ordinary human. But unfortunately, she was shot by this group of siblings called the Struckers, or the von Struckers, who we eventually come to find out in the next volume are a group of evil mutants, I believe, who are tied to a Nazi scientist, like they're descendants of his or something like that. But anyway, though, they're in Africa, and they had come across Storm, and Storm had actually gotten into a fight with them because they were trying to assault this lady at a bar, and Storm single-handedly fought them off. And so in retaliation, one of them, the sister, ends up shooting her with a rifle from a distance, and it doesn't kill her, but the bullet grazes her and gives her a concussion. And so in the Lifedeath 2 chapter, Storm, basically, comes to, and she's, kind of wandering the desert, and she's hallucinating, and, she's in a position where, she's been, contemplating suicide, because, her powers, were something that, were such a part of her that she can't see, life without them. And she's actually, hallucinating, talking to, the X-Men at one point in a cave, and Wolverine, or his hallucination of him, offers to put her out of her misery with his claws. But ultimately, Storm, finds enough motivation to not take that option. And, she soon comes to, find that there is someone that needs help. And there's this woman who had gotten into a wreck, and she's pregnant, and Storm's the only one around, and she doesn't have her powers, and they're both dehydrated, and Storm's the only one who can help her. And so the lady does her best to guide Storm to her village, and Storm gets her there and helps to deliver the baby. And thankfully, the baby, has a chance at life now. But on a sad note, this village, they've had such problems with, the environment and man's manipulation of it, that, they're limited on resources, and there's famine and what have you, and they only have such a limited amount of resources, to where when it comes to like food and water, anytime someone in the village has a child, one of the elderly takes it upon themselves to leave the village and basically just go off and die. And so this tribal elder, when the baby's born, walks away from the village, and Storm tries to go after him, and pleads with him to reconsider that, and saying that you don't have to do this, you don't have to kill yourself, or you don't have to die, you can still help the village, you can still have life. But he basically explains why he's doing what he's doing, and there needs to be a balance, because for a time, this village, was actually in a paradise, because of man-made technology. But then, the technology broke down, and when that happened, the environment, sort of, came back with a vengeance. Like the problems that they were having beforehand, came back, even harsher, and so because of that, and the limited amount of resources that they had, that's why they came to the decision that they did. For whenever a child was born, one of the elderly would go off to die, and so that this elder, he tries to impart this philosophy to Storm, or at the very least help her to understand why he's doing what he's doing. And so he dies peacefully. But in the meantime, though, this lesson of balance isn't lost on her. And so she realizes that just because she doesn't have her powers anymore, that doesn't mean it's the end of her life. And it's just that she has a new life to go and try and gain without her powers. And so the story ends on a bittersweet note, in a sense that this lesson and balance was given to her at the cost of a life, but she still has her life, and so she still has a chance to bring balance to her own. So, yeah, so this was a good collection of stories. I think that, once more, Chris Claremont and the creative team, primarily artist John Romita Jr., they work together to, further develop the characters and, show us, how much they've grown over the years or over the series. And, even when bad things are happening, we see how, it affects them, and, how their philosophies change and how their outlook on life has changed. And, and it's really cool, seeing, familiar faces show up. Say, you've got, the dragon Lockheed showing up on more than one occasion. You have Amanda, Nightcrawler's girlfriend, showing up. And then, of course, you have, Captain America and some of the other Avengers showing up in the Kulan Gath storyline, albeit in a, ancient times counterparts. And of course, Alpha Flight in the Gift storyline. So it's really cool that, and Doctor Strange also from the Kulan Gath storyline. So, it's really cool that you have these characters, that the X-Men have interacted with in prior stories, still having a presence here. And we see how, their interactions have, basically cemented these, relationships and these friendships and what have you. And I also thought it was cool, seeing how developments from prior storylines are having kind of a ripple effect here. You have, Rachel Summers from Days of Future Past, which initially seemed like a one-off story. She ends up, coming back and basically having a major impact on, the ongoing storyline in the X-Men series. And of course, it's just, I really enjoyed the book. I think that overall they, they did a good job with, continuing to, tell some good stories, with good artwork. And John Romita Jr. Doing the majority of the artwork, but also Barry Windsor Smith, doing the artwork for the Lifedeath storylines. And I liked how, this particular collection, had elements of, fantasy and horror, as well as science fiction, because, with fantasy, you have, the Kulan Gath storyline, with horror, you have, the Dire Wraith's involvement, and, those guys were terrifying, okay? And of course, you also had, the energy vampire Selene. So, like, she's technically a mutant, but she may as well just be like a straight up, demonic vampire. Just based on how evil she is and what she does. And also, you have the psychological horror of, I guess, or maybe just existential horror, because you have the characters of, say, like Rachel Summers, and heck, even Nimrod, the sentinel, from her timeline. They're both in a timeline that to their knowledge shouldn't even exist. But then when they find out that where they came from no longer exists, they're both like, what are we supposed to do with our lives, and why are we even here? And they're both trying to adapt accordingly as far as, to the best of their abilities. Of course, Rachel, she's a human, or, mutant, right? But she's, a human being, and, she's having to contend with all the stuff that she went through in her timeline, and having to try and adapt to, being with, a group of X-Men that aren't the same ones that she grew up with. As well as she's having to, contend with, being aware of what humanity really thinks of mutants because of her telepathic abilities. And of course with Nimrod, I mean, for the brief amount of time that we get with him, I mean, even though he's technically a villain, he's not without some sympathy because he's a robot. He's a sentinel, albeit a highly advanced one, to a point where he has a degree of sentience, but not enough to override his programming, unfortunately, but just enough to question it. So I thought it was interesting how you have that sort of. It was like, they were almost mirror images of each other in a way. Rachel and Nimrod, but also I liked. Seeing Rogue's development, and we see just how much she's still having to work with making peace with not only her actions against Carol Danvers, but just the fact that she's got the memories of Carol Danvers in her head. Like Carol Danvers is haunting her, even though she herself is has moved on and regained a new sense of life. The Carol Danvers she used to be is still in Rogue's head. And so basically, Rogue is still feeling the consequences of that. And also, liked seeing, how some of the stories in here, like they sort of start off as fun and games, but then tragedy almost inevitably ensues. I mean, for one thing I neglected to touch on was one of the issues, after the Secret War storyline, the X-Men, when they come back to Earth, they find themselves in Japan, and Lockheed's with them, but they also have a fellow passenger who's this huge dragon that apparently was on the battle world that the X-Men found themselves on, the Secret War storyline. And at first it's all fun and games because this dragon had apparently fallen in love with Lockheed, and when she found herself on the same world that Lockheed was, it's like she's trying to build a nest in Japan, but she's basically causing all sorts of property damage, and the X-Men are having to try and protect the people of Japan. And this ends up resulting in some tragedy, wherein this one woman ends up getting killed trying to protect her baby, and Wolverine's the one who finds her, and he comforts her as she's dying, and you see this woman, she begs Wolverine to take her child, whose name is Amiko, and Wolverine promises to be her sort of surrogate father. And so while the story started off as fun and games, and Lockheed ends up in his own language telling the dragon, hey, I'm not interested. I mean, we had a fun adventure together, but I'm not in love with you, but it's all like in dragon language, right? So the story kind of ends on a note that it would be sort of like a bittersweet cartoon story, but then the fact that real people, or at least real within the X-Men comic, got killed because of this dragon causing all this damage without even meaning to. I mean, it just kind of goes to show that, I mean, the Marvel Universe, I mean, much like in the Ghost Rider series, the Marvel Universe can be a terrifying place to live. I mean, you're going about your life, and then next thing you know, a building's falling down on you because a dragon's trying to, get materials to make a nest, things like that. But, or even say, just, finding a random necklace, I mean, in this Marvel Universe, can end up, opening a door to, for a hellish invasion or something like that, So, the series continues to show that as fun as it is for us readers to, you know, explore the Marvel universe, you know, it's the danger is very real, and you know we always have to be alert. Unfortunately, and oftentimes, you know, and at least in the case of this book, you know, some of the danger is coming from, you know, the very same humanity that the X-Men are trying to safeguard. In the case of, you know, the government, you know, creating, you know, technology to try and kill or capture mutants, you know, or pass, you know, legislation that will allow for the government to be able to round up mutants and things like that. So yeah, I mean, you definitely see that, you know, the danger is coming from multiple sources, but you know, seeing the X-Men, you know, striving to be better than what's around them as far as, you know, try and rise above, you know, the darkness and everything. It's still something that, you know, is compelling. But I will say that, you know, the aforementioned downside of the crossovers is something that gets annoying from time to time. But, you know, Chris Claremont is able to, you know, give kind of an abridged version, you know, through narration as to, you know, what happened, you know, in the chapters that aren't on hand here, at least. So at least we have an idea of what happened. But on the other hand, it is frustrating that certain stories aren't collected in here that would have allowed us to see how certain crossovers carried out. But yeah, the only story in here that I would say was, you know, subpar was the annual, and that was basically like a fantasy story. Like it was a campfire story that the X-Men, like the younger ones, like Kitty Pryde and Illyana, were kind of taking turns telling, and basically, you know, they came up with a story that borrowed from elements and stuff that was going on in the X-Men's lives, and you had this, you know, sort of cutesy wootsy fantasy story that sort of just kind of takes up space. It doesn't really serve a purpose, at least in my opinion. I felt like they could have taken that story out, and you know the flow would have been uninterrupted. But as it is, you know, it's a story that feels kind of, you know, pointless. But you know the rest of the book, though, like with the ongoing story, I mean, is fantastic. And even say the X-Men and Alpha Flight story, the like even if it's say outside of the main ongoing story, it feels like it's a part of it because of, you know, the history that X-Men and Alpha Flight have had with each other at this point. So so yeah, I mean, it's like overall the stories feed into one another, and basically there's nothing that's inconsequential, with the exception of that one annual story that I just mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and give X-Men Volume 5, Essential X-Men Volume 5, 5 out of 5 stars. This is a great collection, and the Essential X-Men line continues to, you know, be, you know, wonderful to read, and I would highly recommend it. And of course, I would also say you check out volumes 1 through 4 prior to getting to this one. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. If you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.